A commercial pilot followed a storm to a small town in Colorado. But the town had been recording that storm for more than 100 years. And inside a quiet archive behind the courthouse, someone had already been waiting for him. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory, where silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. Captain Michael Carter had spent 20 years trusting instruments. Altitude indicators. Fuel flow gauges. Wind vector calculations. Radar sweeps stretching hundreds of miles across the sky. Pilots are trained to trust numbers because numbers do not panic. Numbers do not hesitate. Numbers simply describe reality. But after enough hours above the clouds, most pilots learn something quietly. The sky does not always behave like numbers. Sometimes the atmosphere behaves like a system waiting for balance. Michael Carter had first noticed the pattern 9 years earlier. At the time he was only a co-pilot on Flight 214. The aircraft entered a storm cell that had appeared ordinary on radar. Within seconds the turbulence intensified violently. Lightning flashed across the wings. Engines shuddered under sudden air pressure changes. The aircraft survived. But the experience left Michael with a strange memory. Not fear. Something deeper. The storm had not behaved randomly. It had behaved like a system adjusting pressure. His instructor Harold Bennett had explained something similar years later during a training flight. Storms do not punish, Harold had said. They redistribute pressure. At the time Michael assumed the statement referred to meteorology. But recently he had begun understanding something different. Pressure moved through more than just the atmosphere. It moved through decisions. 3 days earlier he had watched the spiral appear again. Flight 872. 38,000 feet above the Rocky Mountains. The radar had shown a strange curve forming inside the storm system. A spiral tightening across the sky. Michael had requested a minor course deviation. 5 degrees west. A small decision. 7 minutes later the storm divided. 2 pressure arms separating across the atmosphere. The aircraft passed through calm air between them. Passengers never noticed. Meteorologists later described the event as an unusual redistribution of atmospheric pressure. Michael described it differently. A pattern. Because once someone recognized the spiral, it became impossible to stop seeing it. For the next 3 nights Michael studied aviation archives. Cargo routes. Weather diversion logs. Historical turbulence reports. The deeper he searched, the more often the same location appeared. Pine Ridge. A small town rarely mentioned in aviation data. Yet the records showed something strange. Several pressure redistribution events over the past century seemed connected to the same region. Storm systems weakening. Wind currents dividing. Transportation accidents avoided. Michael began mapping the events in his notebook. Each one marked with the same symbol. A spiral. The shape slowly expanded across the page. And at the outer edge of the pattern sat a single location. Pine Ridge. Michael requested a routine weather observation diversion during his next flight. Air traffic control approved the adjustment without hesitation. Commercial flights deviate slightly from planned routes every day. No one considered the request unusual. But Michael knew exactly where he intended to land. The small regional airport outside Pine Ridge appeared quiet when the aircraft touched down. Passengers remained calm. Ground crews prepared the aircraft for its next departure. Michael left the cockpit carrying only his flight bag. Inside the bag rested the brass compass that once belonged to Harold Bennett. The same compass that carried a faint spiral engraving along its metal ring. Michael had carried the instrument for nearly a decade. Yet he had never noticed the engraving before the storm divided 3 days earlier. Now the spiral seemed impossible to ignore. He stepped outside the airport terminal. The wind moved gently across the runway grass. High above the mountains the sky remained calm. But Michael knew something important. Pressure always moved before storms appeared. He rented a small car and began driving toward town. The road passed through open farmland. Low hills rolled beneath the wide Colorado sky. 20 minutes later the courthouse square came into view. Brick storefronts. A small diner with a glowing window. A bakery releasing the faint smell of warm bread into the evening air. Everything looked ordinary. Too ordinary for a place connected to atmospheric pressure anomalies. Michael parked near the courthouse. He opened the notebook again. The spiral map filled the page. Storm redistributions. Flight deviations. Weather anomalies. And at the outer edge of the pattern, Pine Ridge. Michael stepped out of the car. The wind moved softly through the maple trees beside the courthouse. Across the square stood a narrow brick building partly hidden behind the trees. A small sign near the door read, Pine Ridge. Historical Archive. Michael studied the building carefully. If someone had been observing the spiral for decades, this would be the place where the records lived. Because patterns rarely revealed themselves in dramatic locations. They appeared in quiet rooms. In journals. In weather logs. In the notes of people patient enough to notice small changes in pressure. Michael walked toward the archive door. Inside the building, Eleanor Hayes stood beside the wall map. She had been watching the spiral tighten for days. Storm events. River diversions. Transportation anomalies. The spiral had been expanding faster than ever before. Which meant something unusual was happening. The stranger standing near the window spoke quietly. The pilot has arrived. Eleanor looked toward the door just as the knock sounded. She already knew who stood outside. Because the spiral had been guiding him here for days. She opened the door. The man standing outside carried the calm posture of someone used to watching systems carefully. Michael spoke first. I am looking for someone who studies unusual weather behavior. Eleanor nodded. You found her. Michael stepped inside. The archive smelled of old paper and quiet history. But the first thing he noticed was not the shelves. It was the wall map. Pins stretched across the continent forming a slow spiral. Storm redistributions. Flood diversions. Transportation incidents avoided. Moments when pressure had shifted. Michael exhaled slowly. You have been recording it. Eleanor studied him carefully. You have been following it. For a moment neither spoke. Two observers standing inside the same curve of the spiral. Outside the archive window, the wind shifted slightly. High above the continent, pressure continued moving quietly through the atmosphere. And the spiral that had guided Michael Carter to Pine Ridge had only just begun revealing its next curve. For several seconds after Michael Carter stepped inside the Pine Ridge archive, no one spoke. Silence filled the room in a way that felt almost deliberate. Not awkward. Not tense. Just quiet. The kind of silence that appears when two people realize they have been studying the same mystery from opposite directions. Michael stood near the doorway, studying the wall map. Pins stretched across the continent. Storm systems. River diversions. Transportation incidents that had narrowly avoided disaster. Each point connected by a slow curve forming a spiral. Michael walked closer. He did not need to ask what the pattern meant. He had been drawing the same shape in his notebook for 3 nights. You started recording this here, he said quietly. Eleanor Hayes shook her head. No. She gestured toward the shelves surrounding the room. It started long before I arrived. Michael turned toward her. You mean someone else noticed the pattern? Many people. Eleanor walked to the desk and opened the large ledger resting beside the journals. The pages inside were thick and worn with age. Careful handwriting filled each entry. Beside every event someone had drawn a small spiral. Michael leaned forward. "What is this?" "The Observer Ledger." Eleanor turned the page slowly. Entry stretched across more than a century. Storms that changed direction. Floodwaters that diverted into empty fields. Railway accidents avoided when engineers halted trains minutes before disaster. Moments where pressure inside a system had shifted. But something else appeared beside each entry. Names. Observers. Farmers. Weather watchers. Engineers. Travelers. People who had noticed the moment before balance returned. Michael studied the list. Then he stopped suddenly. One name stood out immediately. Harold Bennett. His instructor. Michael looked up. He was here. Eleanor nodded. He visited Pine Ridge in 1972. Michael blinked. He never mentioned that. Eleanor closed the ledger gently. Most observers do not. Michael glanced toward the spiral map again. So he knew about this. Yes. Eleanor walked toward the map and pointed to an older pin near the center of the spiral. 1958. Michael stepped closer. The aviation report he had read earlier appeared exactly where Eleanor pointed. Cargo aircraft deviation. Storm cell divided unexpectedly. Pilot, Harold Bennett. Michael felt a quiet chill move through his thoughts. So the first spiral I ever saw was not actually the first. Eleanor shook her head. No. It was simply the first one you recognized. Michael rested his hand on the desk. The brass compass inside his flight bag suddenly felt heavier than before. Harold Bennett had not only known about the spiral. He had been part of it. Michael spoke slowly. Storms do not punish. Eleanor looked at him curiously. What? My instructor used to say that. Michael looked toward the ledger again. He said storms redistribute pressure. Eleanor nodded. That is exactly what the spiral records. The stranger near the window finally spoke. Not only storms. Michael turned toward him. The man had remained silent since Michael entered the building. His calm expression suggested someone who had watched many similar moments before. Michael studied him carefully. You are the one who told her about the spiral. The man smiled faintly. Only enough to help her notice it. Michael crossed his arms. And you knew I was coming. The stranger nodded. When the spiral tightens, observers find each other. Michael looked back toward the ledger. So what exactly are we observing? The man walked slowly toward the wall map. He placed his hand lightly beside the newest pin. Flight 872. The spiral appears whenever pressure inside a system reaches imbalance. Michael frowned. Weather pressure? Sometimes. The stranger pointed toward other pins on the map. River systems. Rail networks. Highways. Human systems. Pressure exists everywhere, he continued. When that pressure builds long enough, the system must redistribute energy. Michael leaned forward slightly. And sometimes a small decision changes how that redistribution happens. The stranger nodded. Exactly. Eleanor added quietly. A farmer offering shelter. A pilot adjusting course. A railway engineer stopping a train. Michael studied the spiral again. Each point represented a moment where something small had altered something much larger. So the spiral is not predicting disasters. Eleanor shook her head. No. It records the moments when disaster changed direction. Michael exhaled slowly. And observers are the people who noticed those moments. The stranger nodded again. Yes. For a moment the three of them stood silently inside the archive. Outside the courthouse square remained calm. Evening light drifted through the maple trees. The town of Pine Ridge continued its quiet rhythm. But inside the archive the spiral stretched across decades of history. Michael opened his flight bag and placed the brass compass on the desk. Eleanor leaned closer. The spiral engraving along the metal ring caught the soft light of the room. "He carved that," Michael said. "My instructor." Eleanor traced the symbol carefully. "It is the same spiral." The stranger spoke softly. He wanted the next observer to notice. Michael nodded slowly. And apparently it worked. But Eleanor was not looking at the compass anymore. Her eyes had moved back toward the ledger. Something on the final page had changed. She turned the book toward the others. A new spiral mark had appeared beneath the most recent entry. Incomplete. Only half the curve drawn. Michael frowned. "What does that mean?" The stranger answered quietly. "It means the system has not finished balancing." Eleanor looked toward the wall map again. The spiral curve had tightened during the past week. Events appearing closer together. Storm redistributions. Infrastructure incidents avoided. Now the aviation event. And the new spiral forming beneath it. "The pressure is building again," she whispered. The stranger nodded. "Yes." Michael looked toward the archive window. Far above the continent, the atmosphere remained calm. But he knew something most people never considered. Storms rarely appeared without warning. Pressure always gathered first. And the spiral always formed before balance returned. Michael turned back toward the map. "So the next event has already started." The stranger nodded. "And the observers are already here." Outside the archive the wind shifted slightly. Not enough to form a storm. Just enough to remind anyone paying attention that pressure was always moving. And somewhere along the next curve of the spiral, another small decision was already beginning to reshape the balance of the world. The new spiral mark inside the ledger was incomplete. Only half of the curve had formed. A faint line of ink that had not been there earlier that day. Eleanor Hayes stared at it for several seconds without speaking. Michael Carter leaned closer to the page. "You are saying that appeared by itself?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "It did not exist when I opened the archive this morning." Michael glanced toward the stranger. The man remained calm. Almost unsurprised. "You have seen this happen before," Michael said. The stranger gave a small nod. The spiral records moments of imbalance. Eleanor traced the incomplete curve with her finger. "If the mark is unfinished, that means the system has not finished redistributing pressure." Michael rested his hands on the desk. "So something is still happening." "Yes," the stranger said. "And the spiral will complete itself when balance returns." The archive felt very quiet. Outside the courthouse square, the wind moved softly through the maple trees. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested a storm was coming. But Michael knew better than to trust appearances. He had spent thousands of hours watching calm skies that turned dangerous within minutes. Pressure gathered long before clouds appeared. Eleanor closed the ledger carefully. "I want to show you something." She moved toward a cabinet beneath the archive shelves. The wood creaked slightly as she opened the drawer. Inside rested another ledger. Older. Much older. The leather cover had darkened with age. The corners worn smooth. By time. Michael watched as she lifted it onto the desk. "What is that?" "The earliest archive record we have." Eleanor opened the cover slowly. The pages were fragile. Careful handwriting filled the first entry. The date at the top of the page read, June 1873. Michael leaned forward. "This is the first spiral event." Eleanor nodded. "At least the first one recorded here." She read aloud from the entry. A severe storm approached Pine Ridge during the summer harvest. Wind speeds increased rapidly across the valley. Michael listened carefully. Eleanor continued reading. A traveler arrived shortly before sunset seeking shelter. A farmer opened his barn and allowed the man to stay the night. She turned the page. Within the hour, the wind shifted direction unexpectedly. The storm moved east across the ridge instead of south toward the town. Michael recognized the pattern instantly. A storm. Pressure imbalance. A small human decision. And then the redistribution. So the spiral appeared after that. Eleanor nodded. She pointed to the margin of the page. A small spiral had been drawn beside the entry. Michael studied it closely. The shape was almost identical to the one carved into his compass. Who wrote this? Eleanor turned the page again. The first archivist of Pine Ridge. Michael looked up. Which means the spiral was already known in 1873. The stranger spoke quietly from the window. It was known long before that. Michael turned toward him. How long? The man walked slowly back toward the desk. He placed his hand gently on the old ledger. Records like this appear wherever someone notices the pattern. Eleanor frowned slightly. You mean Pine Ridge was not the first place? No. The stranger looked toward the spiral map again. Just one of the places where observers kept records. Michael glanced at the map. Storm redistributions. Flood diversions. Transportation incidents. Aviation anomalies. Each event separated by years. Sometimes decades. But recently the events had begun appearing faster. He pointed to the outer curve of the spiral. These last few happened within days. Eleanor nodded. That is what worries me. Michael crossed his arms. Why? Eleanor turned another page in the old ledger. Because the spiral has never tightened this quickly before. Michael studied the dates carefully. 15 years between one event. 20 years between another. Sometimes even longer. But the newest entries had appeared only days apart. Storm redistribution. Transportation incident. Avoided. Aviation deviation. Now the incomplete spiral forming again. Michael spoke quietly. So the pressure is building faster. The stranger nodded. Yes. Michael looked toward the window. The sky above Pine Ridge remained clear. But the air felt strangely still. As if something larger was moving beyond the horizon. What kind of pressure? Michael asked. The stranger answered calmly. The kind that builds across many systems at once. Weather. Transportation. Energy. Human decisions. Eleanor looked back at the ledger. And the spiral appears when those systems begin influencing each other. The stranger nodded. Exactly. Michael exhaled slowly. So a storm might respond to a flight path. A river might divert after a small construction delay. A train might stop minutes before a bridge fails. The stranger smiled faintly. You are beginning to see it. Michael walked toward the wall map again. The spiral stretched across decades of events. But the newest curve was still forming. And somewhere beyond Pine Ridge, pressure was already moving. Michael looked back toward the stranger. If the spiral marks moments where pressure redistributes, then something must be building right now. The stranger nodded. It is. Eleanor spoke quietly. And when the spiral finishes forming. Michael finished the thought. Balance returns. The stranger looked toward the incomplete spiral mark in the ledger. And the observers will see how the system changes. Outside the archive the wind shifted again. Still calm. Still gentle. But Michael Carter had learned something important during his years in the cockpit. The most dangerous storms often began with quiet air. He turned toward Eleanor. How long does it usually take for the spiral to close? Eleanor answered honestly. We never know. Michael nodded slowly. Then we should start watching. The stranger looked toward the courthouse square. That is exactly what observers do. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, the incomplete spiral rested quietly on the page. Waiting. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, pressure was gathering again. And when enough pressure gathers, the world does not explode into chaos. It searches for balance. Sometimes that balance arrives through storms. Sometimes through rivers. And sometimes through the smallest decision made by someone who does not realize the entire system was waiting for that moment. For the next several minutes, no one spoke. The Pine Ridge archive had become a place of observation. Michael Carter stood near the window. Eleanor Hayes remained beside the ledger. The stranger watched quietly from the center of the room. 3 observers. Waiting. Outside the courthouse square, Pine Ridge looked exactly as it always had. A quiet diner on the corner. A bakery closing for the evening. Streetlights beginning to glow as the sun lowered behind the western hills. Nothing suggested that anything unusual was happening. But Michael Carter had learned something during 20 years in the sky. The most important moments often began quietly. He looked toward the horizon. Far beyond the distant hills, clouds were beginning to gather. Thin formations at first. Almost invisible against the fading light. But Michael recognized the shape. Pressure bands. The early architecture of a storm. He turned toward Eleanor. Something is forming west of here. Eleanor looked up from the ledger. You can see it already? Michael nodded. Not a storm yet. Just pressure moving. The stranger walked toward the window. His eyes followed the same horizon Michael had been watching. Yes, he said softly. The system is gathering balance. Eleanor returned her attention to the ledger. The spiral mark that had appeared earlier was changing again. Another curve had begun forming. The incomplete spiral now stretched farther across the page. She felt a chill move quietly through her thoughts. It is almost finished. Michael walked back to the desk. How much longer? Eleanor studied the page carefully. I do not know. Sometimes the spiral closes in minutes. Sometimes it takes hours. Michael looked back toward the horizon. The cloud formations were growing. Not violent. Just organized. Pressure moving across the atmosphere in slow waves. He had seen storms like this before. Storms that appeared harmless until the system reached a breaking point. But this one felt different. Because now he knew something he had never known before. Someone had been recording these moments for more than a century. Michael turned toward the stranger. You said the spiral appears when pressure becomes unbalanced. Yes. Michael pointed toward the window. So what exactly is unbalanced right now? The stranger answered calmly. Several systems at once. Michael frowned slightly. Weather. Transportation. Human activity. When enough pressure builds across those systems simultaneously, the spiral begins forming. Michael considered that carefully. So the storm is only one part of it. Yes. Eleanor spoke quietly. And the spiral records the moment when balance returns. Michael looked at the ledger again. The curve was almost complete now. Only a small gap remained. Outside, the wind shifted slightly. Leaves moved across the courthouse square. Still calm. Still gentle. But Michael could feel the change in the air. Pressure had begun redistributing across the region. The stranger stepped away from the window. It will happen soon. Eleanor looked up. What will? The moment when the system corrects itself. Michael walked back toward the map on the wall. The spiral pin stretched across decades. Storm redistributions. Flood diversions. Infrastructure incidents avoided. Each one marked the moment when balance returned. Michael pointed to the most recent aviation event. My flight. Eleanor nodded. The storm divided. Michael looked back toward the ledger. And now another spiral is forming. The stranger spoke quietly. Yes. Michael leaned against the desk. So what do observers actually do? The stranger smiled faintly. Watch. Michael nodded. That seems simple. It is. But noticing the moment requires patience. Eleanor looked again at the spiral mark. The final curve had nearly closed. She whispered softly. It is almost complete. Michael turned toward the window again. The clouds beyond the hills had thickened. Lightning flashed faintly far in the distance. Still too far away to hear thunder. But the storm was growing. Michael studied the sky carefully. The pressure bands were shifting. Not strengthening. Separating. He felt the same sensation he had experienced in the cockpit days earlier. The moment before redistribution. He spoke quietly. The storm is dividing. Eleanor looked up immediately. Already? Michael nodded. The pressure is moving north. The stranger watched the horizon calmly. Balance. Eleanor turned the ledger toward them. The spiral on the page completed itself. The final curve connected. A perfect symbol. For a moment the three of them simply stared at the page. Another event recorded. Another system balancing. Outside the archive window the storm clouds began drifting apart. The pressure bands separated across the sky. The storm weakened before reaching Pine Ridge. Michael exhaled slowly. It changed direction. Eleanor nodded. Like the others. The stranger looked toward the spiral map. And the observers were here to see it. For several seconds the room remained silent again. Three people standing inside a quiet archive. Watching the aftermath of a storm that had almost happened. Michael finally spoke. So what does this mean? The stranger answered softly. It means the spiral is accelerating. Eleanor felt the weight of the statement immediately. The events are happening closer. Together. The stranger nodded. Yes. Michael looked toward the horizon. The clouds were already thinning. The system had finished redistributing pressure. But somewhere else another imbalance would eventually begin forming. Michael turned toward Eleanor. How many spiral events have you recorded here? Eleanor answered quietly. More than 30. Michael glanced at the map again. And recently they are happening faster. Yes. The stranger spoke calmly. The world has never carried this much pressure before. Michael frowned. What kind of pressure? The man looked toward the sky again. The kind created by millions of decisions happening every day. Michael considered that carefully. Human systems. Weather systems. Infrastructure. Energy. Everything connected. Everything influencing the balance. Michael looked back at the spiral on the page. So the spiral is not predicting disasters. Eleanor nodded. It records the moment when disaster changed direction. The stranger smiled faintly. And the observers are the ones who notice. Outside the archive, the wind settled again. The storm that had almost reached Pine Ridge faded quietly across the western sky. Balance had returned. But the spiral inside the ledger had already begun preparing its next curve. Because pressure never disappears. It only moves. Waiting for the next moment when someone listens closely enough to notice the change. For several minutes after the storm drifted apart across the western sky, no one inside the Pine Ridge archive spoke. The wind outside the courthouse square had already settled. Clouds thinned slowly above the distant hills. The system had finished redistributing its pressure. Another spiral event had ended. Yet the room felt different now. Not because the storm had passed, but because the three people standing inside the archive had witnessed something together. Michael Carter walked slowly toward the window. From the street below, Pine Ridge looked exactly as it had earlier that evening. A car passed through the intersection. The lights inside the diner flickered softly through the glass. A quiet town continuing its routine without realizing that a storm had nearly shifted its path across the valley. Michael spoke quietly. So this is what observers do. Eleanor Hayes remained beside the ledger. She closed the book slowly and rested her hands on the cover. Yes. Michael turned back toward her. They watch. They record. They notice when pressure changes. Eleanor nodded. And sometimes they understand why. Michael walked back toward the desk. The brass compass rested beside the ledger. The spiral engraving on the metal ring caught the warm light of the archive. For years the symbol had been nothing more than decoration. Now it felt like a message that had taken decades to arrive. My instructor knew about this, Michael said quietly. Eleanor looked toward the compass. Harold Bennett. Michael nodded. He must have seen something like tonight. The stranger standing near the shelf spoke softly. He did. Michael turned toward him. The man's calm expression had not changed since the evening began. You knew him. The stranger smiled faintly. I knew of him. Michael crossed his arms. And you knew about me. The man did not deny it. The spiral tends to guide observers toward each other. Michael studied him carefully. Who exactly are you? For the first time since Michael arrived, the stranger paused before answering. Not because he hesitated, but because the question required something more than a simple explanation. I am someone who noticed the spiral a long time ago. Michael frowned. How long? The man looked toward the old ledger resting on the desk. Before this archive existed. Eleanor glanced up immediately. You mean before 1873? The stranger nodded. Yes. Michael leaned slightly forward. Then how old are you? The man did not answer directly. Instead he walked toward the wall map. His hand moved slowly along the inner curve of the spiral. Storms. Floods. Railways. Aircraft. Events stretching across generations. The spiral has always existed, he said quietly. Long before anyone began recording it. Michael studied the map. So observers have been appearing for centuries. Yes. And you keep finding them. The man smiled faintly. Sometimes. Eleanor looked back toward the ledger. But the spiral is changing. The stranger nodded. Yes. Michael glanced toward the horizon again. The sky above Pine Ridge had returned to calm. But something about the conversation felt heavier than before. What do you mean changing? He asked. Eleanor opened the ledger again. She turned the pages slowly until she reached the most recent entries. For more than a century the spiral events had appeared years apart. Sometimes decades. Storm redistributions. Flood diversions. Infrastructure incidents avoided. But the newest events had appeared within days. She pointed to the dates. Look. Michael studied the entries carefully. The pattern was obvious. The spiral was tightening. The stranger spoke quietly. Pressure across the world has increased. Michael frowned. What kind of pressure? The man looked toward the sky outside the window. The kind created by human systems growing larger and faster. Transportation networks. Energy grids. Global weather patterns. Millions of decisions influencing each other every day. When systems become more connected, he continued, pressure moves faster. Eleanor nodded slowly. And the spiral appears more often. Michael looked back at the map. So observers will be needed more often. Yes. The stranger turned toward him. And that is why you are here. Michael considered the statement carefully. For one storm. The man shook his head. For what comes next? Silence filled the archive again. Michael rested his hand on the desk beside the compass. You are saying the spiral is not finished. The stranger nodded. It never is. Eleanor spoke quietly. There will be another event. Yes. When? The stranger walked toward the archive door. He paused before answering. Soon. Michael felt the same sensation he had experienced in the cockpit when the storm divided. The moment before pressure changed direction. So what are we supposed to do? The stranger looked back at them. Observe. And when the moment comes? Choose. Michael frowned. Choose what? The man smiled faintly. The decision that shifts the balance. Eleanor closed the ledger again. The spiral symbol on the final page rested quietly beneath the newest entry. The storm that had almost reached Pine Ridge had been recorded. Another moment where pressure had redistributed. But the next curve of the spiral had already begun forming somewhere beyond the horizon. The stranger opened the archive door. Cool night air drifted into the room. Before leaving, he spoke one final sentence. You are not the first observers. Michael watched him step outside into the darkness. And we will not be the last. The stranger disappeared across the courthouse square. For a long moment neither Michael nor Eleanor spoke. Finally Michael looked toward the spiral map again. Storms. Rivers. Railways. Aircraft. Generations of observers connected by the same quiet symbol. He picked up the brass compass. The spiral engraving reflected the light one more time. My instructor left this for a reason. Eleanor nodded. So the next observer would notice. Michael slipped the compass back into his bag. Outside the archive the night had grown still. But far above the continent, pressure continued moving through the atmosphere. Waiting. Because somewhere along the next curve of the spiral, another moment of imbalance was already beginning. And when that moment arrived, someone would have to notice. Someone would have to listen. And someone would have to choose. In forgotten places where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to whispers of reckoning. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And every act leaves an echo.